Hi there, my name is Neil Blevins, and this tutorial is a layer breakdown for this painting right here, which is called Coral Desert Wandering 2. And this is an example of a rough painting, but my technique for the rough painting is basically identical to a more detailed painting. It's just how much detail I put into each individual layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all the different groups here and all the layers inside this group and show you what each one does. And hopefully by doing that, you'll get a better idea of how I painted this and also how you might go ahead and paint your own stuff. So frequently people ask me where I get ideas for my paintings, and this one I actually got in a park. I was in a park with my daughter and there were a bunch of big rocks around. Not this big, but big-ish. And I just looked at one of them and all of a sudden I basically had this image pop into my brain. Something where we have this huge rock structure that is sort of like it's smacked into the earth as though it like fell from the sky. A lot of mist and really powerful sunlight going on, and the characters walking in front inside of the mist. And so I got home. The moment I got home after coming back from the park, I immediately roughed in this painting and then proceeded to work on it for a few more hours after that. So the first thing you'll probably notice is I organize my paintings into groups. And the groups are the higher level things inside the painting, and then inside the groups are a bunch of different layers. And if you go to neilblevins.com in the CG Education section, you'll see I have there one tutorial which is a breakdown of all the different layers I tend to set up, all the different groups I tend to set up, and how I organize my Photoshop documents. But this will also delve into that a bit. It's just if you want more details, you can go there for more information. So let's start at the bottom. I will just look at the background layer here, and so to start off with, just a very simple yellow to yellow gradient. Then something I painted in with a big soft brush, just basically a lighter area sort of in the middle. And then here I painted in, these are the far distant mountains, which you can see way off in the distance here. So they don't have to be too detailed, just detailed enough to get the idea across that there's something beyond the giant shape that's here. And you'll also notice that this layer is set to 40. The reason it's set to 40% opacity is this is what I painted originally, and this just sort of pushes it back into the fog. So you could either add fog to it, or in some cases like this where you don't have something too detailed in the back, you can just turn down the opacity and it does pretty much the same thing. And then you also know that there's detail here and there's detail down there, but there's no detail in the middle, and that's just because I knew I had the big giant stone in the middle, so I'm not going to add any detail in an area where I knew I wasn't going to need it. So moving along, we now have the stone group up here, and let me turn all these layers off. So these two layers here creates the main giant rock, and this one here is just a very simple flat shape. And I started off by taking the marquee tool up here and just sort of creating the shape like this. And then after that I went in and I added a little bit more detail with a simple brush. Actually here, let me show you here. So the brush I used to do the painting for most of this is actually this brush right here. So it's a very, very simple brush. It has just a little bit of texture to it, but for the most part it's nothing fancy. I think it's actually based on one of the default brushes that ships with Photoshop. So if you want it, go looking through the default Photoshop brushes, and this is one of them. So so use that to do those edges over there. And then over here is the back, and this just is what gives it the dimensionality. The idea here is that instead of it being a really smooth transition from here to here, this is a very flat rock. So this is like one flat surface that's sheared off, and this is a series of flat surfaces over here, which is why you can get away with using something like the marquee tool to make this. And then this paint layer up here, I just started again with that brush I showed you, going in and just adding a few little cracks going up on the top here. And this was a layer I added afterwards. I actually, painted this stuff first and then added this later on. But the idea was that this area just needed, I thought, a little bit of extra color. So I just took a soft brush and painted in a little more color there. And then this was helping to define the light. So the light source is kind of from up here. It's a little bit behind. But I wanted some light to hit this front surface here, and I wanted to show that as it got lower, it got darker. So I just went in with a really, really soft brush and painted black down here and white up there, and then turned it to soft light, which just lightens and darkens depending on what colors you did, and brought the opacity down to 31. And then the next layer here, this is the only layer here that has any photo in it whatsoever. And let me show you what this is here. So this was actually, when I went to Hawaii quite a number of years ago, and when I was there I took all these photographs of the volcanoes, and the volcanoes had some really cool landscape that had all these like weird cracks and crevices and whatnot, really, really cool rock shapes, and so I took a whole lot of photographs and I used this as a texture. And go back to here. So I took that photograph and I desaturated it, dropped it in over top of here, set it to soft light, and put it down, brought down the opacity so it wasn't too obvious. Also, I'd like to point out that all these layers are on a clipping mask, and so what a clipping mask is the paint here will appear only on stuff defined by the alpha channel of this layer. So up here, for example, the photograph I took is only being applied to the alpha of this layer here. Therefore, the photograph is only being applied to the rock itself. So the next layer here is again some more paint with a regular brush, just adding more striations going across the rock. And then this one here is kind of an interesting reuse. So let me just turn off the layer modes here. So there was another painting I had where I was doing a gas giant, a little bit like Jupiter, and I made a pattern for that, and it had these sort of streaks, these multicolored streaks going across, and I thought to myself that was actually pretty cool, and I could probably use it for this as well. And so what I did was I dropped it in on the clipping mask and then set it to soft light so it applies to the stuff below it, and set the opacity to 100% in this case. And it just added some nice extra random colors, a little bit more yellow, a little bit more red in a couple of spots, which helped add a little bit of variety to the rock surface here. And then finally, these layers up here are very small things. So this one is basically just doing a few little fixes up here. You can see up there, just removing a few parts. This one here just adds a little bit of light up at these top edges, so if the light is coming down, the light is sort of hitting these top edges and then flattening out here to something that's not as bright. And then this one here is just one last little fix to this crack. I just wanted a little bit of a different crack there. Okay, so next we have this mist group. And this is very simple. It's just a series of mists that I put in with a big soft brush, and put a little bit of mist down at the bottom and then a little bit of the mist at the top. I usually like adding, mist shouldn't just be one sort of big dull area. I like also adding these little streaks as though it's sort of little streaks of cloud. I think it adds a little bit of scale to things. And then down here is the ground layer. And so for the ground, let me just hide that. I start off again, very, very flat surface, just painted with that brush. And actually I do this a lot, where I'll paint a single flat surface, and then I will do clipping masks to add shading and more detail over top. So that's a pretty common technique I use. And so this layer here shows off another brush that I use sometimes. Let me just show you in here. Let's see, that one right there. Show it over here. So just get rid of what I had here. And what this brush is really, it's just a series of flattened triangles of slightly different varying intensities. But when you throw a bunch of them together and have a slightly random scale, slightly random rotate, it creates these sort of nice flat horizontal shapes, which I find really useful for doing ground planes like this that are going off into the distance. It just adds a little bit of variety to the ground plane and some plane changes, which gives it a nice texture to it. And then this one here is just a rock brush that I had, which just makes these little tiny rocks, and with a scatter on it to paint them in. And then, let me just get this big brush out of the way. And then this is just another layer of mist, this time going over top of the ground surface. Okay, so now is the characters. And the characters, let me show you this right here, consisted, first of all, this is just very simple painting in of Landis with that simple brush I showed you. And then add a little bit of overall fog. And the way I like doing fog usually is I'll do a layer, which is a clipping mask, set to normal, and then take whatever the fog color is, put it over top, and then change the opacity down. And this just lets me really easily, if I need a little bit of more mist, I can turn this up, I can turn this down. It allows me to go back and edit it rather than painting the mist directly into the character. And then one last layer of mist, except this mist is more at the ground, as though while he's walking it's kicking up sand just around his feet, which really helps integrate characters into these kinds of surfaces. Then this here is the only 3D render part of the image, although it's only barely a 3D render. So I just went in and took one of the side renders of ink that I had from a previous render and dropped it in here, and then did something similar here where I add some fog, which is just on a separate layer. And this one just adds a few little highlights because the light again is coming from the top, so you want those highlights in there. And then painted in arms and legs, which you can see there. And then that whole group is then got a clipping mask which puts the fog on, just like the fog that was on Landis, and then more fog down by the feet. So I could have painted this in, but since I already had a render which already had the right proportions for ink, from the side and everything, I just figured I would drop it in and make it easier to get the right sizes without going in and manually painting it, even though other parts of it were manually painted. Okay, so next is I take the resulting image from all the paint and I bring it into this piece of software, which is called Magic Bullet Photo Looks. And what this is a very simple compositing package, but I use it because it has a lot of really great filters for making the image a little bit more dynamic. And the difference is these filters are fully procedural. So the ones inside of Photoshop, a lot of the filters, once you've run them, it's destructive, which means that the image, once you've run it on the layer, you can't go back and tweak the parameters. And there's some in like newer versions of Photoshop with smart objects, you can sort of have a procedural workflow, but it's still really quite janky. So I like using this piece of software instead. So this is the original image here, and then this is the final image after the filters go on top. And I'm just going to go through and show you all of the different filters and what they do. Okay, so the first one is this diffusion filter, followed by this haze flare filter. And these two do something kind of similar. They basically do sort of a glow. This one has a little more directionality to it, whereas this one's a little bit more overall, taking the bright areas and glowing them out. But I usually use them together. Then the next one, this is edge softness. And so what this does is everything that's inside of this circle is clear and sharp, and everything that's outside goes off to being more and more blurred. And you can see here over by the characters, I can turn this on and off. And so what it's doing is it's just sort of taking this part up here, which we're looking at more closely, leaving it that detailed, and then kind of blurring it off towards the edges, which is a little bit like a vignette. It helps focus the eye on the part that really matters. Also, it sort of does a depth of field effect, although it's a very cheap, simple depth of field, which only works in some circumstances. So next is Chromatic Aberration, and what this does is this kind of simulates what bad cameras tend to do, and that is it will tend to have these fringes around the edges. And in this case what I did was I took the red channel and shifted it over a little bit. You can see the without the fringe and then with the fringe. And you know, for cameras, this is actually something people don't want in their photographs because they want it to not have that effect. But by adding it, it actually makes your CG image, your painting, look more like it's from a camera. So it's a great example of how it's actually a mistake, but if you add that mistake in, it actually makes your thing look more filmic. So then this one over here is an actual vignette, color vignette, and so what this does is everything in here is the same color, and then it blends off towards this area to a darker color. You can see here the strength is set to 30%. So this again just helps sort of focus the eye, so we're not spending too much time looking down here, and most of the time is spent looking towards the center of the image. Then we have film grain. And the film grain is not only being used here for grain purposes, as though this was real film, but it's also, because this is supposed to be like a dirty, dusty environment with lots of sand whizzing by, it also gives, the film grain also gives a little bit of that impression, like there's a bunch of sand flying in the air, which is why usually on the amount here I usually keep it at about 3%, but for this one I upped it to 5%. Then the shutter streak is very subtle in this one. You can kind of see it at the bottom, it lightens it a bit. But what the shutter streak does normally is it pretends like this is a real film frame on real film. And there's, if you take this with a movie camera, there is a frame that is above up here, and there's a frame that's below up here and down here. And what it does is it takes some of the color from this frame and smears it in up here, and some of the color from the frame down here and smears it up there. And it simulates this by taking some of the, like if you have bright colors up here, that bright will smear into the lower part of your image, and vice versa. Again, it's an artifact that you don't actually want in your film, but it happens in film all the time. So by adding it here, it just makes your thing appear a little bit more filmic. Then, these got reversed here. So then here is just a simple curves. So it's just a color correction where it's adding a little more contrast and a little more highlight. And you can adjust these curves manually by pulling and pushing stuff, or you can just adjust the values down here. And then finally the last one is this hue saturation that really is just bringing the saturation down a bit, because when you use a curve and adjust the contrast, things tend to get a little more saturated, and so this is just bringing the saturation back down to a more reasonable level. And so once I've done this, I can go back and change these anytime I want to any values I want. I can go back and paint and then bring the image back in and then run the same series of filters over again. And then I save out this image and bring it back into Photoshop. And I really highly recommend this piece of software. One sucky thing is that Photolux got discontinued by Red Giant, the software company that makes it. They still have a version that works in After Effects, but the standalone that I'm showing you here is no longer available. But I really love the software and I found it really useful. And if you want to give it a try, send them an email. See if they'd be interested, maybe getting you a copy. Maybe if enough people bug them, they'll undiscontinue it, which would be really awesome. But highly recommended. So give it a shot. Okay, so we're back over in Photoshop now, and what I do is, remember this is all the stuff I painted. I then saved out this image, brought it into Photolux, did the filtering, and then saved that image out, and I just literally drop that image here under this final group. And so this is the image directly out of Photolux, and then I decide one last few little tweaks, and that is what I put up here in this CC Final area. And in this case what I did was first I added a tiny bit of a lens flare, and this actually there was this guy online who took photographs of real lens flares with a camera from a bunch of different angles, and he sold them online, so I bought a bunch of them, and they're really, really helpful for just adding a little bit of realism to things. So in this case, here is part of the lens flare, and then I painted it out where I didn't need it, where I didn't want stuff. I mostly just wanted the glow over here and maybe a few of these secondary rings appearing here and there. And then let's go back to the earlier version. There we go. And then once I did that, I set it to screen, and then I added, removed a little bit of the opacity just so it wasn't quite as strong. And then, just to give it one last little kick, I, with a soft brush, just added a little bit of the sky color right here. So it really pushes the idea of the light coming from over in this direction. And then the last thing was just a very slight levels, which I did just to make it a little tiny bit more contrasty, a little bit darker. And there you go. So that's the layer breakdown of this image, and hope you found that interesting. And again, feel free to try some of these techniques on your own images, and visit my website for more tutorials. Go to neilblevins.com and go to the CG Education section. And I also have a YouTube channel. If you want to subscribe to it, please do, and it'll tell you next time I post more tutorials. Thank you very much.